Hi everyone. So today's class on Artemisia Gentileschi is going to have a different start from that which we normally have. I want to show you a clip from an oratorio, a little opera that was made by Alessandro Scarlatti, an Italian composer writing in the second half of the 17th century. The name of this piece is La Giuditta, or The Judith, and references Judith from Judith and Holofernes. Indeed, it does more than reference it. It's a whole two-part piece that discusses the Jewish heroine and her defeat of Holofernes, the Assyrian general. And it serves to show the role that the role and importance that was seen in this story in the 17th century. It's a long piece, and I'll stop it here. But again, it serves to show us that in the 17th century, the importance of the biblical story of Judith and Holofernes transcended the visual arts and was a part of the musical arts as well, and had a power in the culture of its time, which is one of our major touchstones for the class today. And we'll be talking about Artemisia Gentileschi primarily. And of course, she has that a set of paintings of the biblical heroine Judith and her beheading of that general Holofernes. So seeing a different side of that cultural, that theatrical element of the piece, I think presents a rounder view of the time period in which we're talking about. Artemisia Gentileschi, like I mentioned, was born in Rome in 1597. She lost her mother at the age of 12, which meant that she had to care for herself as well as the woman in the family, look after her father and her three brothers. Of these siblings, she was the only one to show prodigious artistic talent. She was trained by her father, who recognized this talent, and was inspired by the compositions of Caravaggio that included striking light sources, the tenebrism, the chiaroscuro, and the working method of that artist. Her early works can be difficult to distinguish from her father. Some notable aspects of her life are that she eventually becomes the first woman to be accepted into the Florentine Accademia of Artists, called the Accademia del Disegno, into which she is inducted in 1616. She moves about the world with a compelling independence for her time, living not only in Rome, but in Florence, in London, in Venice, and in Naples. As of late, and I mean the last 25 years, Artemisia Gentileschi has been of overwhelming interest to the scholarly and popular culture world. But this is a result, or I should say, this is a result of the research of Mary Gerard, who first published a monograph on the artist in 1989. Before that, as many art historians have noted, Artemisia Gentileschi was a footnote in history, not the subject of major art historical monographs. Her work is not the work that was typically given to female artists, who worked on portraits, still lifes, and domestic themes. But rather, she painted the historiated scenes of multi-figure narratives of the Bible, of stories from the Bible, of the saints, and of mythology. She starts working in a Caravagesque style, but then blossoms under the influence of experiences beyond Caravaggio's Rome, at first in Florence and later in Naples. Her paintings are compellingly rebellious on a certain level. The inscription on the drawing that you see here says, "Made in Rome by Pierre Dumonstier, Parisian, the last day of December, 1625, after the worthy hand of the excellent and skillful Artemisia, gentlewoman of Rome." On the reverse, it says, quote, "The hands of Aurora are praised and renowned for their rare beauty, but this one is 1,000 times more worthy for knowing how to make marvels that send the most judicious eyes into raptures," end quote. Praise and fetishization of the hand of the artist appears here in the drawing, while we see accompanying it a portrait of the artist by Simone Vouet, a leading painter from France but living in Rome, a promoter of the Caravagesque style. This tells us how impactful her art was for her contemporaries. As important as she is to us today, she was a person of note and of admiration in the 17th century herself, which is a feat not all artists can claim. Artemisia chose topics that were biblical or mythological in nature, and sometimes are shocking interpretations of those subjects. Susanna and the Elders is the Old Testament story of Susanna, a beautiful, wedded heroine who is accosted and blackmailed by two lecherous old men. Her fidelity and chastity are tested, literally put on trial, when these elders, seeing her at her private bath, blackmail her to either satisfy their desire, their sexual desire, or if she doesn't do so, threaten to accuse her of adultery with a young man, for which she would be sentenced to death. Susanna is, to put it in common parlance, between a rock and a hard place. If she actually succumbs to satisfying their sexual desire, she will have besmirched her own honor. And if she rejects them, they're going to publicly accuse her of adultery, and she'll have to undergo the trial for her innocence, which, being a woman at the time, would have been hard to know with certainty you would win. Susanna's story continues that she does remain chaste. She rejects the elders' attempts on her, and they make good on their evil promise. They accuse her of adultery. A trial is held by a young Daniel, who examines the elders and Susanna and finds the elders guilty. They are condemned to death for giving false testimony, while Susanna escapes with her life when if she had been found guilty, been stoned to death. Artemisia Gentileschi's representation of this scene is unusual. She does borrow from one of the luminaries in Rome, which is the place where this was painted around 1610. Michelangelo Buonarroti, who we've seen pop up in every class as a touchstone for the artists working in the 17th century. And she takes from him the serpentine pose of one of his Sibyls. But unlike other versions of Susanna, she does not show a Susanna that is typical of the time. Here's an engraving of Annibale Carracci's version of Susanna and the Elders, which shows, as was rather common, the Old Testament heroine in something of a more sensuous and seductive pose. Susanna may be, in Gentileschi's depiction of her, exposing more of her body than in any other version of this subject up to this point in time. But what we get is a rejection of these lecherous old men rather than a kind of shy or coyly welcoming, kind of humble representation of the woman, of Susanna, that we see in other versions of this subject matter, like Carracci's here, like the Cavaliere di Arpino's, who we see engaging with us, a kind of sensuality presented by her figure and by her gaze that engages with us, the viewer. She's sort of posing for us as this voyeuristic subject. And in Domenichino's representation of her, where she's represented as weak. In contrast with Artemisia Gentileschi, we get someone who is boldly rejecting these men who encroach on her space, and she reacts believably to their aggression, to the criminality of their aggression. Moving from that painting to another one that is done just a couple years after, we don't know the patronage of this Judith beheading Holofernes. We don't know for whom it was painted. It was painted while she was still in Rome. We can look at this painting and understand that there is a level of realism that was not present in the example I showed you of this subject matter by Caravaggio. It's possible that Artemisia Gentileschi knew of Caravaggio's painting of this subject from 10 years earlier in the collection of Ottavio Costa until at least 1630. And she clearly takes on the tenebristic lighting and theatricality of Caravaggio's work. Where do we see that? In the flat background against which her protagonists act. The spotlighting of her protagonists, this bright light that shines and casts into shadow certain parts of these figures' faces, and that we don't know the source of this light is customary of Caravaggio's style, and we get that in Artemisia Gentileschi's representation. And the realism of the figures themselves, and that's where we get to some differences. Because what's really striking with Gentileschi's representation of the scene of the beheading is the blood. In Caravaggio's version of this, and we talked about this last time, we looked at the hesitancy, reluctance, resistance, repellence to the act of beheading the Assyrian general, and the ribbons, the kind of falseness for all of its realistic depiction here that the blood has. And those are the two main features that strike us as different from Caravaggio's painting in Gentileschi's version. The face of Judith is much calmer, poised, confident, And the blood is much more realistic as it seeps into the fabric and mattress, the linens and the mattress of the bed on which Holofernes struggles. We also, another major difference in this version is we get not a haggard, elderly maidservant for our Abra figure, as we do in Caravaggio, but we get a youthful accomplice for Artemisia Gentileschi's version. Gentileschi probably knew Caravaggio's version, but she may have also been familiar with the work of Adam Elsheimer, who was an artist from Northern Europe. He's from Frankfurt, Germany, and was among the earliest Northern artists to adopt a Caravaggesque lighting system. His paintings are different in size and scale than Caravaggio, than Gentileschi. He was not painting massive altarpieces or huge oil paintings for major patrons. Instead, he painted on copper and on a very small scale, kind of like 8.5 by 11 size. But they're typically historical narratives, so he's that in common with Gentileschi and Caravaggio. And many of them are nocturnes. He did not live a very long time, and he was in Rome for about 10 years until his death in 1610. And so he's inspired by what he sees in Caravaggio's work. And we can see the beautiful lighting that he has in his paintings. He gives us a light source, this candle here, which realistically shines light across Judith, who's got the sword in her hand, and is striking the second blow on Holofernes' neck. So it's a slightly different moment in the narrative with the arm raised in this almost smiting pose, but we get the kind of scene of struggle and the orientation of Holofernes' body at a diagonal across the picture plane is something that is taken up by Gentileschi in her version here. So it strikes us as rather similar. This is the more famous version of the painting, and it's the more violent of the depictions. The one in Florence at the Uffizi that you see on the right here was not cut down like the earlier one. So we see more of the figure of Holofernes. Actually, it strikes us as even more similar to this because we get more of his body. This is probably a way that she's kind of reprising an earlier version, sort of similar to what her father did with multiple versions of Topic. But this one had a patron, Duke Cosimo II de' Medici, the Duke of Tuscany. And it's produced in her Florentine period. She moves to Florence in 1613, and she's there for the next 7 years, where she is really engaging with this dynamic group of artists and scholars of all different types, including people like Galileo and the great nephew of Michelangelo Buonarroti, whose name was Buonarroti the Younger. It's also the period in which she becomes the first woman to be inducted into the Accademia del Disegno, the formal Tuscan Academy of Drawing and Painting and Arts. So this was a moment in her career, this sort of a high point for her, because she has this important patron with whom she's working, even though he doesn't pay her right away, one of the problems of being an artist at this time. So she has to negotiate that. But for this princely patron, we get a more princely painting. What are the differences here between these two versions, besides what I've already noted? We get a perhaps even more determined Judith, kind of more of a sense of determination on her face. She's wearing a amber colored dress, and with that we get a refinement of her dress in the form of a bracelet which has enamels of Greek cameos on them that show the mythological figure of Diana or Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, a famously virgin goddess who's known for her expertise in hunting, and so kind of expertise in violence. I'll show you a detail of that here. The bracelet with the cameos on it. We also get a swapping of colors for other aspects of the canvas. The maidservant, instead of wearing the crimson, we see her wearing a kind of toned down version of this, and she's not struck by the lighting as prominently on her dress. Gentileschi's version shows Holofernes wearing, depicted with a red velvet blanket over his body. He resists in much the same way as in the former canvas, but the way that blood emerges from his head is even more dramatic, even more theatrical, and we can see it's arcing up here, kind of projected up, and we'll come back to this in a moment. So this is typically interpreted as the more violent version because of that blood, which we see still very realistic, but splatters on, shows splattering onto her dress, and we have this kind of spatter pattern emerging from the wound on Holofernes' neck. It touches her hand. She's getting kind of dirty. This isn't this photoshopped version of this horrific event. We have this moment, horrific moment in time, this very violent moment in the narrative that's stopped in its progress and frozen for us by the artist. It's actually through her correspondence with her friend Galileo that we learn she was not paid quickly for the Judith beheading Holofernes that she painted for the Duke. He died shortly after this was completed. This painting, Duke Cosimo II de' Medici, died shortly after this painting was commissioned, and Galileo was someone closer to the Medici court with whom Artemisia was writing to get her just payment for this canvas. And we learn about it not from the original letter that she wrote to him, or from the original conversation that she had with Galileo, but from a later letter written in 1635 when she was trying to get payment from another Medici duke. These guys just weren't good at paying their artistic debts, apparently. And she reminds him that he had helped her previously with securing remuneration for the painting of Judith for Duke Cosimo. So this is an interesting moment of connection with Galileo on the part of the artist attempting to get what she deserved in terms of payment. But there's another tie-in that scholars have proposed with Galileo that's very interesting. And that is his own scientific observations and discoveries. So Galileo, had made drawings using his telescope, observing what he had seen of the moon. And he made 7 watercolor drawings. He probably made these himself that show the pockmarked, cratered surface of the moon, a literal new lens through which the moon could be seen. In an article written by David Topper and Cynthia Gillis, the influence of Galileo's studies of parabolas and Galileo's development of the parabolic law of projectiles also had an influence on Artemisia Gentileschi. In mathematics, the parabola is defined in a two-dimensional space as having a symmetrical arc. It goes up, imagine like a cannon shooting, it goes up, and depending on its weight and other factors, it enters into a parabolic trajectory, which is bilaterally symmetrical course or arc. And when you look at Artemisia Gentileschi's spurting blood, she's, according to these authors, and I find this to be a convincing argument, taking on that parabolic trajectory in the arcs that we see. These pieces here are kind of crummy, but you get the idea that it's similar to Galileo's own drawings identifying this theory in mathematics.